I will ignore you, stomp on your heart, and always put my needs and interests first.
You will use anyone to get what you want, even if it means putting them in danger.
Now I'm one step closer to solving this case. That is what is important. Besides, there's nothing quite like the feeling of being proven right.
Wait, you read Italian?
Of course. It's a native tongue of Machiavelli.
Welcome, Bruchim Abayim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. Pro tip for those of you that might wish to offer a drasha or devar Torah in the future. If you begin talking about the political underpinnings of the editorial decisions made in the creation of the Torah that we have today, you may just lose a few folks. There are multiple reasons for this, not the least of which being the disrepute into which the word politics has fallen. Quick dictionary look, however, and hopefully we can at least find a tiny bit of common ground and agree that this is not completely fair. Definition 1 reads, the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate between parties having power. Only the most wanton and most blind reading of Torah would suggest that this does not apply to Torah. There are whole swaths of Torah dedicated to activities associated with governments. And yeah, there are multiple perspectives and parties involved. And indeed, the mitzvot are often broken down into Ben Adam leMakom and Ben Adam leChavaro, between human and the eternal and between human and fellow human. Some may imagine that if authorities would disappear, we would all live in peace and harmony, except that this utopian vision has been proven false at any point of history. It's been tried or envisioned for more than tiny family groups. And even then, I'm not so sure. That means chukot, mishpatim, laws and regulations, and getting those moving is politics. And the mitzvot between human and human are expressions of politics. Between human and the eternal is religion and ritual. Between human and fellow human, well, it's also religion. It's also politics. So I imagine that it is the second definition that trips us up. Definition 2, activities aimed at improving someone's status or increasing power within an organization. Oh, doesn't that sound wonderful in the 21st century? If I make a claim that Torah is engaging in this aspect of politics, this is where I'm going to meet a little resistance. Now, in all honesty, acknowledge the first level of resistance will come from a fundamentalist view of divine inspiration, because how dare we mix our holy books with talk of
human interference?
Here I am talking about if not the foundational work for cultures that represent roughly half the people on this planet, as if it were a work of humans. Problem is that unless we are juxtaposing the divine inspiration with possession, even a more literal understanding of divine inspiration still involves a human holding a pen, a pencil, a stylus, a rock chisel. Even if divine inspiration is an anthropomorphic God speaking through a human, and I am most certainly not making that claim, unless this hypothetical anthropomorphic God uses the human like the Von Trapp family uses puppets.
High on a hill was a lonely goat, hoodlay, hoodlay, hoodlay.
You're welcome. The uniqueness of the human influence is how that divine voice is communicated. A common Jewish teaching addresses this challenge directly in the differences between the two Decalogue appearances, the 10 utterances, 10 commandments, in the Torah, the one in Exodus and the one in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, we are told to Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Whereas in Deuteronomy, we read a slight variation, Shemot Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The classic explanation observes that translating divine inspiration is a bit complicated. The universal presence communicated something to Moshe Rabbeinu regarding our relationship and the Sabbath. And what was passed on was multifaceted enough to require two varying translations to capture the wordless whole. Within this more literal view, at the very least, we need to deal with the thesaurus issue. If Torah were given to a prophet whose mother tongue was American English, the divine will might express something that one prophet, with their specific life experience, vocabulary, and intellect, might interpret as happiness, whereas a second may inscribe joy on the sacred tablets, and if a third writes bliss, the debates that will rage for centuries on the subtle meanings may completely ignore the prophet number 3 simply heard the word bliss more often growing up. All three words have different connotations, but as humans interpreting a wordless divine will, we still bring our own language into the dialogue. Oh, and notice how often the concept of interpretation comes up just trying to unpack the human element of inspiration. With a less literal view, we have an opportunity to discuss exactly what divine inspiration is without worrying about lightning bolts. I, personally, am a big believer in divine inspiration. I think it's a thing, but believe it to be a naturalistic process whose ultimate source remains Ein Sof, the central unknowable truth of the universe that we just can't describe. Therefore, it's not contradiction to live a deeply religious life while simultaneously believing the textual sources of that religion were written by multiple hands over centuries and were subject to various editorial processes. The fact that these texts contain so much subtle interconnection, archetypal truth, and a mirror to the complexity of what it means to be a flawed human is the very reflection of divine inspiration. Something not inspired would fall into the same dustbin as last year's beach reading. Our problem is that when we attach divine inspiration to something, we want the process that brought it about to be devoid of human frailty. We don't want messy. Our lives are messy. Moses's shouldn't be, even if the Torah narrative makes it as clear as possible that his life makes ours look perfectly organized, blissful, and without strife in comparison. We demand divine inspiration looks a certain way. Torah doesn't. Just think of a piece like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I choose this one because most folks in the Western world will recognize the opening motif, even if they can't necessarily name the piece or composer.
And they're off with a 4-note theme. This is very exciting. The beginning of a symphony is always very exciting, folks. I don't know whether it's slow or fast yet because it keeps stopping.
Or agree on if it's a theme or a motif.
Well, Pete, the technical term would be motif, which he uses to build a theme.
If you've never heard that, you really need to. I'll link it down below. I also choose it so I could play that clip, but because every list ever made of most recognizable classical works put this one at the top. In the world of 19th century European music, this is not one left in the dustbin of last year's beach Spotify list. One might think a piece with such historical endurance certainly came from some platonic place of inspired form. Divine inspiration. Right up until, if we have this idea of non-messiness involved in inspiration, you visit the Beethoven Museum in Vienna and look through all the brusquely scratched out endings where the maestro rejected his own work over and over until finding that one that, as it turns out, would endure. Why do we force ourselves to picture sacred texts as anything different? Do sacred things come to us via a magic wand and a zap, or via a process? And if humans are the medium through which this process works, how can it be any surprise if the process is occasionally messy? It is through this lens that I find the events of Parashat Korach the most fascinating. I usually work hard to keep my academic writing apart from my religious interpretations, but Korach beautifully joins the two. Here we have a Levite who is not a son of Aaron. He's not a Cohen, and therefore not at the very center of temple ritual. You know, today the Kohanim and certain shuls get to do the really cool priestly blessing thing, and the Levites, well, they do the hand washing. Korach didn't like that. And Korach, in his own definition number 2, politicking, seeks to turn the people against Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron have proposed a hierarchy that is held up by law. Korach utters what seems to be a sensible utopian vision of universal equality and is struck down. His great sin? You, Moses and Aaron, have taken too much upon yourselves, and since the entire congregation are holy, and the eternal is in their midst, why do you raise yourself above the assembly of the eternal? Good question. Just as, why in the heck did he get struck down for that, is a good question. In the world of cynical answers that comes from the unfortunate God of wrath interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, the answer, in that case, is obvious. The Hebrew God is petty, and how dare someone question the divine will? For those wishing to delve somewhat deeper, notice that Korach didn't actually say something truly beautifully universal, such as, are we not all children of the same universal source? I could have gotten behind that. Instead, he said, we are all holy, which for some strange reason reads to so many like, we're all good, or we're all worthy. That's not what holiness is, though. The Hebrew underpinning with the root letters Kuf, Dalet, and Shin that we translate into holy means something closer to separated and elevated. An object isn't holy just because. It's holy because it's set aside for a specific elevated use and remains in use for only that elevated purpose. Korach kind of actually spoke a little bit of nonsense. Don't you know everyone is separated and elevated? All right, even that could be made to sound reasonable until you go back to the process part of this. Something is not holy. It becomes holy through process, intentionality, and effort. Korach was literally saying the opposite of the spiritual wisdom that comes out of pretty much every religious tradition. We all require work and refinement. Yeah, the raw stuff of our existence comes from the pure stuff of the universe. My God, the soul that you've given me is pure. But after that, we enter a life journey that requires refinement. We're perfect as we are, but we're not perfect as we are. Last week I talked about two truths in the same room. This is another one of them. Korach, to gain power, told the people what they wanted to hear, yet the opposite of what we as humans actually need. We probably shouldn't tell a 5-year-old entering kindergarten that they needn't work at all to acquire any knowledge. They are just perfect in the state that they are. If we do, we're kinda harming them. Okay, that kinda was to be nice. Don't do it. What we are trying to do is balance the your existence is perfect in all the nuance that makes you you with the parallel truth that the journey of life requires growth, learning, refinement, and yes, even on occasion, overcoming some of those base realities in our being. We're fine as we are, but we are most certainly not fine as we are. That this balance is so hard to communicate explains so much confusion among so many people. Still, the punishment for Korach and his followers seems a little harsh. The earth opens up and swallows the rebels. The flame springing from the incense fire pans does the rest, unless completely captured in a God plus Moses equals good and all else is bad equation. Korach's narrative is a little jolting. So, into the academic stuff just for a minute. We know from the Tanakh that there were various groups of Levites over the centuries, not only leading up to the first temple, but as well into the temple times that led ritual that, according to the Torah, was meant to be only led by Kohanim, the sons of Aaron. At some point, the politics of the centuries, yes, I said it, politics, placed the Kohanim in the center of power in the southern kingdom of Judah, along with the Davidic kingly line from the tribe of Judah. Remember, among the Jewish people, straight out of the text, without me having to put on any academic hat at all, there were multiple kingly lines from multiple tribes. Saul, for example, came from the tribe of Benjamin, and the powerful house of Omri, powerful as attested by sources outside of the Hebrew Bible, were possibly Issacharites. It's not necessarily clear, but most certainly were not from the tribe of Judah. All right, why does any of this matter? Well, today, if we have any relationship with the Tanakh, we know that the kosher place to have the temple was Jerusalem. The kosher high priests were the Kohanim. The kosher people to interpret the divine voice were the prophets, and the kosher line of kings was the Davidic. This isn't anything new to us if we're Jews. This is the clear experience we have from reading the Tanakh. We know this in spite of just as clear stories in the Tanakh where non-Kohanim made sacrifices. David, as he marched the ark into Jerusalem, made sacrifices, dressed in an ephod, like a priest. We know other cities had temples to the eternal. We know magicians, sorcerers, and necromancers interpreted the divine voice, and non-Davidic kings also ruled the Jewish people. To get us from that complexity to what we all know to be true, took politics. And the politics that it took had a bit of a Machiavellian flavor to it. You see, we don't know who Korach actually was. All we have is the Torah narrative. Torah narratives, like all sacred books, are about theological truth, even if they're not historically true. That dichotomy is something that only became problematic in the last, maybe since Romanticism. The Torah narrative presents a man who sought to challenge Moses and Aaron, and therefore the God that chose Moses and Aaron had to make sure that the one who challenged them no longer was. Perhaps it went down that way, the way that it's written in Parashat Korach. I doubt it, as much as I doubt the sun standing still is meant to be literal, or that Methuselah lived 969 literal years. The Torah speaks in everyday language, and everyday language includes metaphor, symbol, allegory, polemic, and politics. What I can easily imagine is that the group of people that over several centuries from the time of the Babylonian exile attempted to collect and edit multiple texts from multiple Jewish groups with multiple tellings of the Jewish narrative ended up with decision makers primarily in the Jerusalem Cohen prophet David camp, as opposed to the Tel Dan, Korachite, sorcerer Ephraimite camp. In this constellation, the case for Jerusalem, for example, would have been easier to make, as the temple in Dan had been destroyed 150 years earlier than Jerusalem. And hey, they said from the perspective of the time in the exile, look, the Persians just let us leave our captivity and specifically go back to Jerusalem to rebuild our temple. But once back, what if there were some Levitical groups out yonder speaking smack against Davidic kings, prophets, and oh no, the Kohanim that had charge of the temple in Jerusalem? Chances are that the Kohanim had not been in charge of the temples in the long-destroyed northern kingdom of Israel. Whose sons were serving the eternal in Dan? Were their families still around? Does one give up power so easily? And by the way, everything I'm talking about isn't quite as speculation as you think. It's actually captured in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I know, before we have Ezra go out and read the forgotten Torah to those gathered in Jerusalem, let's make sure that what he reads includes a story about the ancestor of those troublemakers over there. You know, the sons of Korach, and what happened to Korach and his followers when they questioned the leadership of Aaron and his sons. Is anyone feeling uncomfortable yet? Even if you think that my interpretation of events is way off. Heck, even if you think that this qualifies as some sort of heresy, even though that word really doesn't exist in Judaism, what is it about this kind of historical hypothesizing that makes us so uncomfortable? Is it because our biblical ancestors would never act Machiavellian? Have you ever read the Bible? I mean, seriously, just off the top of my head, speaking of Levites, go back and read the story of Shechem in chapter 34 of Genesis. I mean, read it. No Machiavellian things there. It's more likely that the part of us that we most wish to hide is the part of us that sees ourselves as above reproach in our daily behavior. And yet, slip a subtle word here, email there, steaming dagger in the back there, and under the bus throwing there, until we get the promotion instead of them?
But I deserve the promotion. I am justified, so I didn't actually do anything wrong.
No, we have nothing in common with our biblical ancestors whatsoever. The truth is, we know nothing about and can know nothing about a historical Korach if there was one. I would like to, without anything but raw conjecture, imagine that Korach's ideas were as spiritually deficient as claiming that without any work we have nothing to elevate or improve. I would like to imagine the political actions of the pro-Cohen faction led us in a better direction, that it was more inspired, as it were. But those of us now most offended by this underhanded sneaking of a historical critical analysis of sacred texts into a sermon might even feel for Korach. Maybe the sons of Aaron now represent the types of misuse of power that have captured headlines in the new emerging moralities and ideologies of our time. Perhaps Korach and his sons would have been much better leaders for the Jewish people. I doubt it, especially as the version of Judaism that has come down to us has survived beyond all human probability. When's the last time you went to a religious service led by a Hittite, a Jebusite, an Amorite? Something worked. The actual iterative question of this sort of academic insinuation into spiritual matters is twofold. First of all, why is it so uncomfortable for us to discuss potential historical events behind the narrative that may be different from the sacred narrative? What is it about our definitions of divine and sacred that makes this problematic? If we demand literal from our sacred texts, we're going to have to deal with scary facts, like the utter impossibility of the number of folks counted in the book of Numbers coming out of Egypt representing an impossibility. The population of Egypt in 2000 BCE was roughly 1.5 million. In 1000 BCE, it was roughly 2 million. A literal reading of Numbers puts the Exodus population at between 2.5 and 3.5 million. You know, down in the super fertile Sinai without a single archaeological trace to be found. Our religion can be brilliant and intelligent and sophisticated, but not if we force it to be something it was never meant to be to begin with. In order to maintain the comfort of literal readings, we need to close off a part of our intellectual capacity. So if we're experiencing discomfort from interpreting any part of Torah with a finger in the world of academic inquiry, chances are we need to reevaluate the difference between spiritual or theological truth and that which would be captured on a mobile phone and posted to social media. Thank goodness, Torah is not social media, although maybe a silly cat video would get more people to shul. The other question that arises is if our discomfort comes from seeing a very human process in the formation of the sacred texts that remind us of the parts of ourselves we do not wish to acknowledge. The Tanakh is holy, not because it's filled with perfect humans acting ideally, but rather because it contains the messy process by which we actually elevate and become elevated. Life is messy. Sometimes progress is hard, and Torah reflects all these truths, well, truthfully. The question is if we're ready to read Torah as it is, or if it has to forever remain a reflection of who we wish we were not. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Vechino vekol zimra